At what I thought was a normal family dinner, my parents showed off their new Lexus and lavish kitchen. Then my grandmother asked a simple question that exposed their 5-year lie. Jessica, what have you been doing with the $2,000 a month I've been sending you? My parents' faces turned to stone. They thought their biggest problem was their ungrateful daughter. They had no idea my grandmother had just started a war to take back everything. My name is Jessica Riley, and I'm 32 years old. The engine of my old Honda Accord rattled a familiar, tired rhythm as I turned onto the leafy, oak-lined street in Brookline. I clutched the steering wheel, a sense of weary obligation settling over me. Sunday dinners were a ritual, one that felt more like a summons than an invitation. As I drove, I rehearsed the safe topics: the weather, Boston sports, anything but my career. On the house I pulled up to stopped my breath. It was my parents' address, but it wasn't their home. The modest colonial I grew up in was gone, replaced by something grander. The lawn was impeccably manicured, the flagstone walkway was new, and parked in the driveway was a gleaming silver Lexus RX 350. So pristine, it still had the temporary dealer plates. It made my Honda, with its faded paint and minor dings, look like a relic from another era. Igni and I walked inside to the sharp chemical smell of fresh paint. The entire first floor had been gutted and reborn. The cozy, cluttered kitchen was now a cavernous, open-concept space. My mother, Susan, was the centerpiece. She leaned against a vast island of Calicut quartz, a crystal glass of Chardonnay, held elegantly between her fingers. She wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "And there you are," she said, her smile a carefully constructed mask. "Your father finally got that big promotion at the firm. We decided we deserved to enjoy it a little." Her gaze performed its usual critical sweep, starting at my sensible shoes and ending on my face, lingering for a moment on my simple work blouse and slacks. A faint sneer tightened her lips. "You know, Jessica, you should really think about finding a real job. Playing with pillows and fabric swatches is a cute hobby, but it's not going to buy you any of this." In the words were a familiar needle prick, a well-practiced jab at my self-worth. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but forced a tight, polite smile. "It looks beautiful, Mom. Congratulations to Dad." The comment settled in my stomach like a cold stone. Dinner was beef Wellington, an elaborate show-off dish my mother only attempted when she wanted to impress. The statement tonight, however, was one of suffocating tension. The pastry was flaky, the beef was perfectly pink, but the air in the dining room was so thick I could barely swallow. My older brother Kevin, always the family's shining star, the Wharton graduate, looked haggard. He stared into a glass of whiskey, downing it in sharp, aggressive gulps, refilling it twice before the main course was even cleared. My father, David, was a ghost at his own table. He was unnervingly silent, a study in passive agreement, offering only a clipped nod to everything my mother said, his eyes firmly fixed on his plate. He looked like a man holding his breath. And then the front door opened, and the entire atmosphere shifted. In my grandmother, Eleanor, entered. She didn't need to announce her arrival. Her presence commanded the room, sucking the very air from it. A former real estate mogul from New York, she carried an aura of quiet, unshakable power in her tailored Chanel suit. She surveyed the renovated kitchen with an appraiser's cool, calculating eye, her gaze lingering for a moment too long on the new Lexus through the picture window. And when she took her seat, her movements deliberate and graceful, The small talk was brittle, strained, but Eleanor cut through it with surgical precision. "That's quite the car, David," she began, her voice dangerously calm. "Insurance management must be paying very well these days." My parents froze. I saw my father's hand tremble slightly as he reached for his water glass, his knuckles white. "Ah, yes," he stammered, his voice thin. "The market's been favorable." My mother jumped in, her voice a little too bright, launching into a frantic monologue about bonuses and portfolios, a string of empty words. Eleanor just listened, her expression unreadable, letting the silence that followed speak volumes. And the tension was a living thing, a palpable predator at the table. By the time my mother brought out dessert, she placed a perfect New York cheesecake on the table with a theatrical flourish, a queen presenting her crown jewel. It was then that my grandmother turned to me. Her voice was warm, laced with the genuine, uncomplicated affection I had always cherished from her. "In Jessica, darling," she said, and the whole table went still. "I just want to make sure of something. Is the $2,000 I've been sending you each month enough to help you get by? I know how difficult it can be to run your own business." The world tilted on its axis and spun into silence. The clatter of my fork hitting my porcelain plate was like a gunshot in the sudden, deafening void. I stared at her, my mind a complete blank. Then my gaze snapped to my parents. Their faces were ashen, drained of all color and life, like wax figures melting under a hot light. My mother's smile was frozen in a grotesque rictus. "And money?" I finally managed to whisper, the word feeling foreign and sharp in my mouth. What money?" And my grandmother's warm, loving eyes instantly turned to ice. She didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed, cold and penetrating, aimed like a weapon directly at my mother. "And Susan," Eleanor said, and her voice was no longer warm. It was dangerously level, each word a chip of stone. "Perhaps you should explain to your daughter why she knows nothing about the support fund I established for her 5 years ago." And her words were like a key, unlocking a dark room in my mind I never knew existed. And in that room, a memory I had tried to seal away flared to life. I suddenly remembered the look in my mother's eyes when I brought home my first art award. It wasn't pride, it was envy. In the silence in the car on the drive back to my small apartment in the South End was a physical presence. It was filled with the echoes of my grandmother's words and the ghost of my mother's envy. That single piercing look from my mother wasn't new. It was just the first time I had been forced to truly see it. The revelation at the dinner table wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime, the final, undeniable proof of a truth I had spent years trying to ignore. It was a truth built brick by brick, year by year, in the architecture of their disdain. And I remember the day I told them my plans for the future. I was 18, filled with a nervous excitement. I sat them down in the living room, my acceptance letter to the New England School of Art and Design clutched in my hand. I told them I was going to major in interior design. My father, David, didn't yell. He did something worse. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of profound disappointment, and shook his head slowly. "A waste of good money, Jessica," he mumbled into his newspaper. "A complete waste." And my mother, Susan, was far more direct, her words honed to a cruel point. "Darling," she'd said, with a smile that was all teeth, "people pay for lawyers and doctors. They pay for things they need. No one pays a fortune for someone to pick out the color of their drapes." In throughout my college years, That sentiment became their mantra. Every time I came home for a holiday, the question was always the same, asked over a dinner table, just like the one tonight. So when are you going to give up this little hobby and get a respectable job? They never once called it my career. They never called it my passion. To them, it was a phase, a frivolous and silly rebellion from their practical, unartistic daughter. An expensive mistake they had to endure. In their universe, there was only one son, and its name was Kevin. My brother was their masterpiece. Every one of his achievements was a family triumph, a story to be told and retold to friends at cocktail parties. The acceptance letter from the Wharton School of Business was framed and hung in my father's study. His first six-figure job on Wall Street was announced in the family Christmas letter. They spoke of his success as if they had personally orchestrated it, as if his ambition was a direct reflection of their own good parenting. My successes, however, were met with a dismissive wave of the hand. I remember the exhilarating thrill of getting my first project featured in a local Boston design magazine. I bought 10 copies, my hands shaking with pride. I drove to their house and spread the magazine open on the kitchen counter. My mother glanced at it, her eyes barely registering the glossy photos of the Beacon Hill apartment I had poured my soul into. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her attention already drifting back to her copy of People magazine. "But did you hear about Kevin? He just put a down payment on a condo in Tribeca. Imagine that." On the constant, relentless comparison was a slow-acting poison. It eroded my confidence, making me question every choice, every victory. It didn't matter what I accomplished, it would never be as real, as tangible, as a Wall Street bonus or a prestigious zip code. In their eyes, I was a disappointment, a faulty product from an otherwise perfect assembly line. And there was only one person who saw me, really saw me. My grandmother, Eleanor. She was the one who, without a second thought, booked a flight from LaGuardia to Logan just to attend my senior thesis exhibition, while my parents made a brief, perfunctory appearance before rushing off to a dinner reservation. Eleanor stayed for hours. She walked through the crowded gallery, studying every one of my design boards, examining my material palettes, and listening, truly listening, as I explained my concepts. She asked thoughtful questions, her focus absolute, granting my work a level of respect I had never once received from my own parents. And I can still feel the warmth of her hand when she took mine at the end of the night. Her eyes, bright and intelligent, sparkled behind her designer glasses. "Jessica, don't you ever let anyone tell you that what you do is worthless," she'd said, her voice firm but kind. "You are creating beauty out of chaos. You're making the world a more livable, more joyful place. That is a rare and precious gift. You cherish it." And her words weren't just praise, they were a lifeline. They were cool water on a parched and barren soul. She saw my passion not as a flaw, but as a strength. She saw my career not as a hobby, but as a calling. And she had given me the strength to believe in myself. But ironically, it was that very belief, that fierce pride she had nurtured in me, that made me hide my struggles from her when I hit rock bottom. Because I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing my own hero. And the pride my grandmother had instilled in me was a double-edged sword. It gave me the courage to start my own design firm, to carve out a space for myself in a competitive city. But it was that same pride that forced me into silence when my world began to crumble. I couldn't bear to tell her I was failing. I couldn't disappoint the one person who believed in me. So I struggled alone, in the dark, And when the pandemic hit, the economy seized up. My biggest client, a boutique hotel project that was supposed to be my breakthrough, pulled out overnight. My carefully constructed business plan evaporated. My laptop screen, once a canvas of creative potential, became a recurring nightmare of red numbers and overdue notices. The rent for my small studio in the South End, the crippling monthly payment for my student loans, the health insurance premium that seemed to mock my dwindling bank account. It was an avalanche of debt, and I was buried beneath it. And there was a month I couldn't make rent for my apartment. The shame was a physical weight. I took the professional-grade camera my grandmother had given me for graduation, the one I'd used to build my entire portfolio, and walked into a pawn shop. The man behind the counter gave me a fraction of what it was worth, his eyes indifferent. I walked out with enough cash to keep a roof over my head, feeling like I had sold a piece of my own soul. And my diet became a grim rotation of Campbell's tomato soup and saltine crackers. Food was no longer about enjoyment, it was about survival. I remember one afternoon, standing in front of the deli counter at a corner store, my stomach aching with hunger. I stared at a simple turkey and Swiss on rye, priced at $5.50. I opened my wallet and counted the loose change. I was 20 cents short. The humiliation burned in my throat, hot and acidic. I walked out of the store empty-handed, my eyes stinging. That night, while my parents were likely debating which fine dining restaurant to try, I was rationing crackers. And in a moment of profound weakness, I made a mistake. My phone rang, and it was my mother. I was so bone-tired, so desperate to hear a familiar voice, that I answered. "Are you okay, Jessica? You sound exhausted," she asked, her voice laced with that feigned concern she did so well. Unlike a fool, I cracked. I let a sliver of my reality slip out. I told her work was slow, that things were difficult. I wasn't asking for help, only for a word of comfort. What I received was a lecture. A long, weary sigh traveled through the phone. "I told you so, didn't I?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is the consequence of not listening to your father and me. You see, stability is what matters. Now don't call here crying to us. Your father and I have our own problems to deal with." And the line went dead, leaving a dial tone buzzing in my ear. The cruelty of it stole my breath. Later, through a casual comment from my brother, I learned what their problem was at that exact time. They were agonizing over which shade of pearl white to choose for their new Lexus. The image of them debating paint colors, while I was debating whether to eat or pay my electric bill, was a new, refined level of torment. And the breaking point arrived in a sterile, legal-sized envelope. It was a final notice from my landlord, taped to my apartment door. The cold, impersonal font spelled out my doom. I had 10 days to pay 3 months of back rent, or eviction proceedings would begin. The words blurred before my eyes. 10 days. On that night, I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I sat on the cold, hardwood floor of my living room, surrounded by the cardboard boxes I had never fully unpacked, monuments to a life I hadn't had the energy to build. The city lights of Boston glowed outside my window, a world away. For the first time in my life, I truly considered giving up. I saw my future laid out in stark, bleak terms. Close the company, liquidate what little I had left, and fill out an application to be a barista at Starbucks. I would serve coffee to people who lived the life I had once dreamed of. The feeling of absolute, crushing failure washed over me. I had fought so hard, for so long, with every ounce of my being, and I had lost. In a wave of pure panic, I did something I had never done before. I called Kevin, not to ask for money, but just to hear the voice of someone who understood the pressure to succeed. And his response changed everything. And my hands were trembling so hard I could barely hold the phone. I called Kevin with no expectation, only a desperate need to hear a voice that wasn't steeped in judgment. I braced myself for a lecture, for the familiar disappointment. Instead, his voice came through the line, weary but kind. I explained the eviction notice, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame and panic. He listened without interruption. "Anne and Jess, I'm in the middle of this messy divorce. My own finances are a wreck," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his sigh. "But I can't let you get thrown out on the street. I'll send you something. It won't be much, but it'll be something." And a few hours later, a notification from my banking app lit up my phone. A small deposit had appeared in my account, just enough to cover 1 month's rent and keep the landlord at bay. The relief was so overwhelming, so profound, it brought me to my knees. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. I felt like I wasn't entirely alone in the universe. In a foolish burst of optimism, I mentioned it to my mother during our next obligatory phone call, hoping she might share a flicker of my relief. Her reaction was swift and cold. "And he's got enough to worry about with his own life falling apart, and you're bothering him for handouts," she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You're just a leech, Jessica, always needing something from someone." Her words extinguished the small, warm flame of hope in my chest, leaving behind nothing but cold ash. It was her cruelty that finally pushed me to do what I should have done months earlier. I swallowed my pride and called my grandmother, Eleanor. I didn't ask for money. My shame was still too great for that. I just needed to talk, to unburden myself to someone I knew wouldn't judge me. I told her everything: the failed projects, the sleepless nights, the gnawing fear. And she listened in her usual thoughtful silence. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her voice came, laced with steel. "You will not give up," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a command. "You are not a failure. You are a businesswoman facing a downturn. I will help you." The next day, a wire transfer appeared in my account. It wasn't a small sum. It was enough to cover all my back rent and give me a cushion for the next few months. I cried with gratitude, believing it was a one-time gift, a lifeline from the only person who had ever truly championed me. But then a strange thing happened. The next month, another deposit appeared, a smaller amount, but it was there, and the month after that, another. A quiet, steady stream of support was flowing into my life. I was confused, but my first thought was of Kevin. I assumed he was doing this secretly, trying to help me without fanfare despite his own troubles. I sent him a heartfelt text message. "Kevin, I don't know what to say. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." He simply replied with a heart emoji. I didn't press him further, not wanting to make him uncomfortable. I just accepted the quiet generosity, attributing it to the brother I always wished I had. It was around this time that my parents' behavior grew even more peculiar. During our phone calls, they became jumpy and evasive. Any mention of my grandmother would cause them to abruptly change the subject. Once my mother let something slip. "Eleanor called to check on you again," she said offhandedly. "I told her you were still having to go to your regular doctor's appointments." "On what appointments?" I asked, completely baffled. I hadn't seen a doctor in over a year. "No, nothing," she backpedaled quickly. I must have gotten you mixed up with someone else. My mind is a sieve these days." It was a clumsy, unconvincing lie. At another time, my father offered some unsolicited financial advice. "You need to be careful with your money these days, Jessica," he said, his tone oddly paternal. "Even the money your grandmother gives you shouldn't be spent frivolously." I remember thinking it was strange. How would he know Eleanor was giving me money? I had never told them. And I brushed these moments aside as parental anxiety, as their usual brand of awkward, misguided concern. I explained away their nervousness, their strange comments, their frantic efforts to steer conversations away from my grandmother. I was so grateful for the financial stability, so relieved to be back on my feet, that I didn't want to see the red flags waving frantically in my face. I didn't want to believe that anything sinister could be lurking beneath the surface. And I ignored all those signs, choosing to believe in my brother's kindness and my parents' clumsy concern. I was lying to myself. And then that fateful dinner arrived, and all the lies were burned to the ground. And the memory of that dinner doesn't play back in my mind as a continuous scene. It's a series of sharp, brutal snapshots, frozen moments burned into my memory with the searing heat of betrayal. My grandmother's calm, devastating question, "Perhaps you should explain to your daughter," hung in the air, thick and heavy. The puzzle pieces from the last few years, the mysterious deposits I'd credited to my brother, my parents' strange evasiveness whenever Eleanor's name came up, the bizarre, clumsy lies about non-existent doctor's appointments, all clicked into place with a sickening, gut-wrenching clarity. On my mother's face, twisted into a grotesque mask of performative shock, she forced a laugh, a high, brittle sound that seemed to crack the crystal glasses on the table. "Mother, what on earth are you talking about?" she chirped, her voice trembling with the effort of her deception. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding. A bank error, perhaps? You know how they are." And Eleanor didn't flinch. She was a statue carved from granite. She placed her dessert fork down on her plate with a quiet, deliberate clink. The small sound echoed in the cavernous dining room, a gavel striking down judgment on a case that had already been decided. "There is no misunderstanding, Susan," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling frequency that vibrated through the floor. "My bank statements are quite clear. I have the copies right here in my purse. 60 transactions, $2,000 each, transferred over the last 5 years into a joint account you claimed was an emergency fund for Jessica." She paused, letting the weight of her words suffocate the remaining air in the room. "You even fabricated a story about her having a chronic illness to elicit my sympathy and ensure the payments continued. A new low even for you." Each word was a hammer blow, nailing the lid on the coffin of their lies. My father, David, finally found his voice, or a pathetic, reedy version of it. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the new hardwood floor, and half rose as if to flee. "Eleanor, please," he pleaded, his hands held up in a weak gesture of surrender. "We can explain everything." On my grandmother's head snapped towards him, her eyes like chips of flint. "Then explain, David," she cut him off, her voice slicing through his weak attempt with contempt. "Explain to me why you were taking the money, meant for your daughter's survival, to buy luxury cars and renovate your kitchen. Explain to me how you could sleep at night, knowing she was struggling to pay her rent, to eat, while you were living on her stolen future." On across the table, Kevin let out a long, low whistle, a sound of pure, weary disbelief. He picked up the whiskey decanter from the sideboard and poured a generous amount into his glass, not even bothering to look at our parents. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, frozen and pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with a dawning horror as she stared at my mother. She looked like she wanted to melt into the floor and disappear. And my own voice felt trapped deep in my throat, a scream with no sound. I turned to my parents, my mind reeling, desperately searching their faces for a denial, for an explanation, for anything other than the stark, ugly guilt that was written all over them. Mom? Dad? The words were a child's plea. And that's when my mother finally broke. The elegant, sophisticated facade she had so carefully constructed for decades finally crumbled into dust. It didn't fall away gently, it exploded, revealing the raw, ugly bitterness that had been festering underneath for years. "And you were always her favorite," she shrieked, her voice cracking, with a venom that stunned me into silence. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me, her face contorted with a lifetime of rage and resentment. "She gave you everything, the talent, the attention, the damned money. Why shouldn't we get a little piece of that? Why should we be the ones to struggle? We raised you, we fed you, we paid for your education." And her scream was a physical blow. It felt like a slap across the face, knocking the air from my lungs. The room swam, the edges of my vision blurring, my chest tightened, an invisible band constricting around my ribs, making it impossible to breathe. The lies, the deception, the years of feeling less than, the quiet dismissals, the praise for my brother, while I stood invisible beside him. It all coalesced into a single, agonizing point of pain in the center of my being. "And so you stole my money?" I asked, my voice a broken whisper, hardly recognizable as my own. The words felt like sandpaper, scraping my throat raw. Son, my mother just glared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. It was my father who answered. He couldn't meet my eyes. He stared down at his half-eaten slice of New York cheesecake, as if it held the secrets to the universe. His shoulders slumped in utter, cowardly defeat. "And it was about $120,000, he mumbled, his voice so low I could barely hear him over the frantic pounding in my ears. "Over the past 5 years. $120,000. The number was abstract, meaningless. It didn't compute. All I could see were the nights I'd gone to bed hungry, the shame of selling my grandmother's camera, the sheer cold terror of the eviction notice taped to my door. Every sacrifice, every moment of fear, every tear I had shed, they had paid for this house, this car, this life built on my stolen security. In $120,000. The number danced and swirled in the dizzying vortex of my mind. But as the initial shock began to recede, it was replaced by a creeping, ice-cold dread. This was the lie they had been caught in. But what other lies were there? Another colder question began to form in the wreckage of my heart. Was this everything? The air in the room was thick with the stench of unveiled lies. My mother's furious justification about paying for my education still hung in the air, a pathetic, screeching attempt at martyrdom. But my grandmother, Eleanor, remained perfectly, terrifyingly calm. Her composure in the face of such chaos was the most frightening thing in the room. It was the calm of a general who had already won the war and was merely observing the enemy's final, desperate throes. She turned her gaze back to my mother, a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in theatrical disbelief. "You paid for her education, Susan? Is that the story you're telling yourself to sleep at night?" A fresh wave of confusion washed over my shock. My mind reeled back through years of carefully planted remarks. I remembered the constant, casual reminders throughout my college years, the frequent lectures about how they had to tighten their belts, how they had sacrificed so much for my expensive hobby. They had worn their supposed sacrifice like a heavy cloak, a badge of honor they could flash whenever they wanted, to remind me of the debt they believed I owed them for the rest of my life. And Eleanor didn't wait for an answer. She was the prosecutor and the judge. Because according to my records, she continued, her voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, the Riley Educational Trust Fund, which I established for each of my grandchildren upon their birth, paid for every single penny of their undergraduate tuition, in full, directly to the universities. In on the impact of that statement was seismic. Kevin, who had been staring morosely into the amber depths of his whiskey, snapped his head up. The weary cynicism on his face was replaced by a raw, new kind of shock. His wife, Sarah, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked from Eleanor to my parents. I just stared, completely bewildered. A trust fund? The words sounded foreign, like a concept from a movie about wealthy East Coast dynasties, not my middle-class suburban life. And for the first time all night, Kevin's voice cut through the fog of his own misery, sharp and clear and dangerously sober. "Where is that money, Dad?" he asked, his gaze pinning our father to his chair. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. My father flinched as if struck. He stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an escape route he couldn't find. There were some investments, a few bad deals. They didn't pan out as expected. A short, ugly sound of derision escaped my grandmother's lips. It wasn't a laugh, it was a noise of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Investments, David?" she scoffed, leaning forward slightly, her voice dripping with ice. "Don't you dare call throwing your children's money at speculative tech startups and risky offshore ventures an investment. Call it what it was, gambling. You gambled with your children's futures to chase a fantasy." And Sarah, her face now a pale, sickly shade of green, turned to my father, her voice a trembling whisper. My fund, too? The money for our future house?" The suffocating, guilty silence that emanated from my parents was all the answer she, and all of us, needed. My mother looked away, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on the tablecloth, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. My father's head sunk lower and lower, his shoulders collapsing inward, as if the weight of his decades of deceit had finally crushed his spine. They hadn't just stolen from me, the daughter they resented. They had stolen from all of us. From their golden boy, the son whose success they paraded like a trophy. From the daughter-in-law they pretended to adore. They had systematically, callously plundered the very futures their own mother had tried so desperately to secure for us. But the final, most vicious cut was yet to come. It was the one reserved just for me. Eleanor's gaze softened as it fell on me, but the sudden, overwhelming pity in her eyes was almost worse than her anger. It made me feel small and fragile, like a broken doll she was about to fix. "Jessica, my love," she said, and her voice was gentle now, which somehow made the words that followed even more horrific. "Your student loan debt, the one you've been so diligently paying off every month for years, it was settled 3 years ago, paid in full directly from your trust. My lawyer has the signed, notarized confirmation." And the world went silent. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, a keening wail that blocked out all other sound. It was the sound of my entire reality shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "Fadonia, no," I whispered, shaking my head slowly, trying to ward off the truth. "No, that's not possible. I just made a payment last week. I get the statements from the loan company every month." My grandmother's voice was clear and steady, a lighthouse in my personal storm of disbelief. "Those statements were being forwarded to your parents' address, Jessica. The money you've been paying, your hard-earned money, has been going directly into their personal bank account." And the floor didn't just fall away from beneath my feet. The entire universe collapsed into a black hole. This wasn't just theft. This was a different, more profound level of evil. This was a calculated, long-term act of psychological warfare. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had actively, knowingly, sadistically allowed me to struggle under the crushing weight of a phantom debt. They had watched me panic over money, listen to my fears, and then cash the checks I sent them, money I earned through my own sweat and sleepless nights, to fund their lifestyle. They had turned me into an unwitting accomplice in my own fleecing. They had made me a fool. The anger inside me was no longer hot and explosive. It turned to ice. A strange, chilling calm settled over me. I stood up from my chair, my movements steady and deliberate. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The pain was too deep for that. I just looked at them, at these two people who had given me life only to methodically drain it from me. And for the first time, I didn't see my parents. I saw two strangers, two thieves. I turned my back and walked away. Ija and I walked out of that house and didn't look back. I drove home in a state of numb, chilling calm. When I got to my apartment, the first thing I did was turn off my phone. I couldn't handle the inevitable onslaught. For 3 days, I shut out the world. I didn't eat. I barely slept. I just sat on my sofa, staring at a blank wall, letting the full monstrous scope of their betrayal wash over me in waves. Their voices, their lies, their shrieking justifications echoed in the hollow space of my apartment. On the third day, curiosity got the better of me. I turned my phone back on. It immediately buzzed to life, a frantic cascade of notifications. 37 missed calls, dozens of texts. I scrolled through the voicemails, my thumb hovering over the delete button. I listened to one. It was my mother, her voice thick with syrupy, manipulative tears, begging me to call her, telling me I was tearing the family apart. The next was from my father. His voice wasn't apologetic. It was angry, accusatory. "How could you do this to us, Jessica?" His voice crackled with indignation. "After everything we've done for you, you're destroying this family." And the sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. They were the thieves, the liars, the architects of this entire disaster. And yet, in their twisted narrative, I was the villain. I deleted the messages, a cold, hard anger solidifying in my gut. On the 4th morning, there was a knock on my door. It was Kevin and his wife, Sarah. They looked as exhausted as I felt. For the first time in our adult lives, there was no awkward distance between us, no shadow of parental comparison. We just sat in my small living room, 3 survivors of the same shipwreck, united in a silent, shared grief. Inouan. After a long moment, Kevin, the brother who had always been the strong, unflappable one, buried his face in his hands and began to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs of a man whose entire foundation had been ripped out from under him. Sarah sat beside him, rubbing his back, her own eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She told me, her voice trembling, that she had almost dropped out of her master's program because they couldn't afford it, never knowing a fully funded trust existed in her name. We realized then how skillfully our parents had divided us, pitting us against each other with lies of scarcity and favoritism. Now, stripped of those lies, we were finally seeing each other clearly. "Anan, we can't let them get away with this," Kevin finally said, lifting his head. His eyes were bloodshot, but his voice was filled with a steely new resolve. "Not this time." In an as if on cue, my phone rang again. This time it was Eleanor. Her voice was calm and steady, an anchor in my swirling sea of chaos. "Come to New York, Jessica," she said simply. "Come to my apartment in Manhattan. There are some things you need to see." In 2 days later, I was sitting in my grandmother's stunning penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. The view was a panorama of power and success, everything my parents had craved and tried to fake. She didn't offer platitudes or comforting hugs. She offered something far better: ammunition. Xian. She placed a thick, leather-bound file on the glass coffee table in front of me. "My lawyers have been busy," was all she said. I opened it. Inside was the entire sordid history of their greed, meticulously documented. There were bank statements showing transfers from our trusts into their personal accounts, followed immediately by payments to luxury car dealerships and high-end contractors. There were copies of the trust fund documents outlining the exact terms they had violated. There were damning email exchanges between my father and a series of shady investment brokers, detailing the catastrophic losses of their get-rich-quick schemes. The final tally was even more staggering than I had imagined. Over the last decade, they had funneled nearly $400,000 of our money into their pockets. I stared at the black and white proof, the cold, hard numbers on the pages. A strange thing happened. The searing pain in my chest began to recede. The hurt didn't disappear, but it was overshadowed by something else. A cold, clear, and absolute certainty. The emotional fog had lifted, and for the first time, I wasn't a victim. I was a woman with evidence. My grandmother asked me what I wanted to do. I looked down at the file, at the undeniable proof of their crimes, then up at her worried but resolute face. "And I want them to face the consequences," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Not in a court of law, in front of the world they tried so hard to impress." My grandmother, Eleanor, chose a battlefield of her own design. It wasn't the chaotic theater of a public courtroom, but a sterile mahogany-paneled conference room on the 40th floor of her lawyer's high-rise office in downtown Boston. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city skyline, a glittering testament to real power and influence, the very things my parents had desperately tried to imitate. There was no pretense of a family gathering, no beef Wellington, no cheesecake. This was a corporate execution, cold and bloodless. The air in the room was cold and still, recycled and smelling faintly of paper and lemon polish. It felt like a morgue. My parents sat on one side of the long, polished table, looking shrunken and insignificant under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights. They looked as if they had aged a decade in a single week. The arrogant self-satisfaction they wore like a second skin had evaporated, leaving behind the hollowed-out, haunted look of pure animal fear. On the other side of this vast expanse of wood sat my grandmother, a portrait of icy composure, flanked by her silver-haired, stone-faced lawyer, Mr. Davies. Kevin, Sarah, and I sat beside them, a silent, united front. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life. My mother, true to form, began with a tearful, rambling apology. It was a performance of remorse so transparent and poorly rehearsed that it was deeply insulting. We never meant for any of this to happen," she began, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a pristine tissue she'd produced from her handbag. "We just got in over our heads. We made some mistakes. We always loved you kids so much." Mr. Davies cut her off without even looking up from the thick stack of papers in front of him. "Mrs. Riley," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, a flat, professional drone. "We are not here to discuss your intentions or your feelings. We are here to discuss consequences." And he let that word hang in the air for a moment, a stark and heavy thing. Then he began, laying out their situation with the cold, dispassionate precision of a surgeon about to perform a radical amputation. He detailed the specific statutes they had violated, the potential prison sentences, the irrefutable paper trail. Then he presented them with two options. There would be no discussion, no negotiation. "On option 1, he stated, his cool blue eyes finally lifting to meet theirs, "my clients, your children, will file a civil lawsuit for the recovery of all misappropriated funds, plus punitive damages and legal fees. Concurrently, we will hand over this file." He tapped the thick, leather-bound folder on the table, a tangible object of their doom, to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. It contains substantial, incontrovertible evidence of multiple felonies, including wire fraud, grand larceny, and forgery. You will be publicly arrested and tried. Your names and faces will be in the Boston Globe. Your friends at the country club will read about it over their morning coffee. And given the strength of this evidence, he paused, letting them absorb the full weight of it. Prison time is not just a possibility, it is a probability. And now my mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat. My father's face, already pale, went completely white, the color of bleached bone. He looked like he was going to be sick, right there on the expensive Persian rug. Mr. Davies continued, his tone unwavering. "Option 2. You agree today to a private settlement to make your children whole. You will sign a legally binding agreement to liquidate your assets. This includes the immediate sale of the house in Brookline, the Lexus RX 350, your stock portfolio, and any other valuables necessary to repay the full amount embezzled from the 3 trust funds." He slid a calculator printout across the table. The total, with compounded interest calculated over the relevant periods, comes to $482,614.27. In he let them stare at the impossible number before he delivered the final, killing blow. He slid a thick document across the table. This agreement also contains a permanent non-contact clause. All future communication with your children or your grandchildren, present or future, will be conducted exclusively through my office. You will forfeit any right to see them, speak to them, or contact them in any way without the unanimous written consent of all 3 of them. And the finality of it was absolute. It was a choice between public ruin and a quiet, private annihilation. They had to choose which poison to drink. My mother predictably chose to fight, not with logic or reason, but with the only weapon she had left in her depleted arsenal, manufactured outrage. You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch that was ugly and raw. "You're throwing us out on the street. We're your parents. This is elder abuse. How could you be so cruel? You are ungrateful, heartless children." In the words which once would have pierced my heart, with a hot poker of guilt, now felt utterly powerless. They were the desperate, impotent cries of a tyrant who had just lost her throne. In my grandmother, who had been silent and still as a sphinx until this point, leaned forward. Her voice, though quiet, cut through my mother's hysterics like a razor. "Ungrateful Susan?" she asked, a dangerous calm in her eyes. "You stole your children's futures to buy a car and a new kitchen. You lied to them, you manipulated them, and you stood by while your daughter nearly lost everything. Do not ever speak to me of morality again." And that was it. That was the final blow that shattered their defenses. My father, who had been a silent, trembling mess, finally and completely broke. A deep, shuddering sob escaped him, a sound of utter devastation. He reached for the pen with a shaking hand. He didn't read the documents. He didn't have to. He just started signing, his signature a frantic, messy scrawl on each page. The desperate mark of a man signing away his entire life, the fraudulent life he had built on a foundation of lies. And my mother watched him, her mouth agape in disbelief, and then her rage collapsed into a pathetic, whimpering defeat. She too picked up the pen and signed. The entire edifice of their lives, the pride, the social standing, the carefully curated image of upper-middle-class success. It all crumbled to dust right there in that cold, silent conference room. I watched the last of their power drain away, leaving them exposed as what they truly were. Two selfish, frightened people who had squandered everything for nothing. As we stood up to leave, my mother looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a venomous, pleading hatred. I met her gaze and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no sadness, just a vast, quiet emptiness. As we stepped out of the lawyer's office into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun, I didn't feel celebratory. I didn't feel a rush of victory. I just felt empty. The war was over. Now it was time to face the wreckage. The weeks following the meeting at the lawyer's office were quiet. The emptiness I felt walking out of that conference room lingered. A hollow ache in my chest. There was no joy in their defeat, no triumphant celebration. It was the quiet, somber relief that follows a necessary amputation. You are saved, but you are left with a phantom pain, a constant awareness of the part of you that is now missing forever. And 3 months later, a letter arrived, forwarded by Mr. Davies's office. It was from my mother. For a foolish, fleeting moment, a flicker of hope ignited within me. I thought, perhaps, that losing everything had forced some kind of reckoning, some sliver of remorse. And the hope died as I read. So the letter was 4 pages long, written in her elegant, looping cursive. But the words were ugly, steeped in self-pity and blame. She wrote endlessly of their suffering, the humiliation of the forced sale, the hardship of moving into a small rented apartment, the loss of their friends and their social standing. She blamed Eleanor's ruthlessness. She blamed our ingratitude. She painted herself as the matriarch of a family that had been tragically torn apart by greed, our greed, not hers. And all I ever wanted was what was best for this family, was the final gut-punching sentence. When there was not a single word of apology, not a hint of accountability, nothing. A and I read it once, then again, to make sure I wasn't imagining the sheer depth of her delusion. Then I calmly folded the 4 pages, walked over to the fireplace in my living room, and dropped the letter into the flames. I watched as the edges curled, blackened, and turned to ash. That, I knew, was the end. The final brittle thread of connection had been severed. And it took another 6 months before I agreed to see them. Not because I had forgiven them, but because I needed to do it for myself. I chose a neutral location, a busy, impersonal coffee shop, halfway between my apartment and theirs. And they looked haggard and bitter, aged beyond their years. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a drabness that seemed to seep into their skin. They started to speak, to offer excuses, but I held up a hand to stop them. "And I'm not here to yell," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not here to listen to apologies you don't mean. I'm here to tell you my truth, just once, so that you understand." And I looked them both in the eye. "You didn't just take my money," I began, my voice clear and calm. "You took my trust. You watched me struggle and you let it happen. You actively undermined the independence I worked so hard to build for myself. You taught me that family love is conditional, that it's transactional, that it's riddled with lies. That's a terrible lesson to teach your child." And I let the words hang in the silence. "I need time," I concluded. "A lot of time. And I can't promise that things will ever go back to the way they were. I don't think I want them to." And I stood up, left a $10 bill on the table for their coffees, and walked out without looking back. It wasn't a victory, it was a funeral for the parents I wished I'd had. But in the ruins of that old broken family, a new one was beginning to grow. The wall of lies that our parents had built between me, Kevin, and Sarah had crumbled, and we were finally finding each other in the wreckage. We started our own tradition, Sunday dinners. Not in a formal dining room under a cloud of tension, but squeezed into my small apartment or Kevin's new place, filled with easy laughter, cheap wine, and honest conversation. There were no judgments, no comparisons, just acceptance. And in with the money rightfully returned to him, Kevin quit his high-pressure Wall Street job and started his own financial consulting firm, one that focused on ethical advising. The crushing weight of our parents' expectations was lifted, and for the first time, he seemed truly happy. Sarah, free from the phantom financial burden, re-enrolled in her master's program with a renewed sense of confidence and purpose. We were no longer defined by the roles our parents had assigned us. We were simply us. And we were survivors. We were a family forged in fire, not in blood. The day the check arrived from the escrow account, the check for the full staggering amount that was rightfully mine, I didn't run to the bank. I didn't celebrate. I put it in a drawer, got in my car, and drove out to the coast, to Cape Cod. I took off my shoes and just sat on the cool sand, watching the endless, rhythmic push and pull of the waves. I wondered what a new beginning was supposed to look like. That check sat in my desk drawer for a week. It wasn't an object of triumph. It was a symbol of a painful debt, finally paid. When I finally did deposit it, I didn't use the money to buy a larger apartment or a fancy car. I didn't try to replicate the hollow, materialistic life my parents had so desperately chased. I poured every single dollar back into the one thing that was truly mine, my work. And I moved my company, Riley Designs, out of my cramped apartment and into a bright, airy studio in the heart of the South End's Arts District. I hired 2 talented young designers, both hungry and full of ideas. I invested in the best software, the finest materials, and a state-of-the-art 3D printer. I bet on myself with my own money, and my business soared. And soon, the local design magazines that had once ignored me were calling for features. Then came the national publications. Architectural Digest did a spread on a Back Bay townhouse I redesigned. LA decor featured my work on a modern Cape Cod beach house. One afternoon, standing in a space I had transformed from a dusty, forgotten shell into a living, breathing work of art, I finally understood my own legacy. It wasn't something that could be held in a trust fund or passed down like silverware. It was forged in my own mind and built with my own two hands. That was a wealth no one could ever steal from me again. My definition of family changed too. It was no longer a word tied to obligation and pain. My family was now Eleanor, Kevin, and Sarah. We spent holidays together, renting a big house in the Hamptons for a week in August, our days filled with sun, sand, and easy laughter. Our Sunday dinners became a loud, chaotic, and joyful tradition. My grandmother, now a little frailer, a little slower, would sit at the head of the table, her eyes shining with a quiet, profound happiness as she watched us. She had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. Family isn't about the blood you share. It's about the people who choose to show up, who choose to love you, and who choose to respect you unconditionally. 2 years after that fateful dinner, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a Kegged Women in Design Year conference in Boston. I stood on a stage in front of hundreds of young, ambitious women, sharing my story, not the parts about betrayal, but the parts about resilience and believing in your own vision. And after my speech, a young woman approached me, her eyes brimming with tears. She couldn't have been more than 22. She told me she was a painter and that her parents were pressuring her to quit art school and get a real degree in business. She asked me how I found the strength to keep going when the people who were supposed to support me the most were the ones trying to tear me down. And I looked at her earnest, worried face, and I saw a perfect reflection of my younger self. I saw the same fear, the same doubt, the same desperate hope to be seen. And I smiled, a genuine, warm smile that came from a place of deep peace. I took her hand in mine. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you that what you do is worthless," I said, the words echoing the gift my grandmother had given me all those years ago. "Your art has value because you create it. Believe in yourself, fiercely and unapologetically, even and especially when no one else does." In that moment, watching a wave of relief and determination wash over her face, I knew my healing was complete. The betrayal no longer defined me. It was no longer an open wound, but a healed-over scar, a reminder of a battle I had fought and won. It was just one chapter in my story, and it was the chapter that had forced me to find my own unbreakable strength. So thank you for joining Jessica on her journey to reclaim her power. Her story is a reminder that our true worth is never defined by those who try to diminish us, and that sometimes our truest family is the one we find along the way. So if her story resonated with you, please know you are not alone. This community is a place for survivors. We would be honored if you shared a piece of your own story in the comments. Perhaps tell us, who was your Eleanor? The person who believed in you when no one else would? Like and subscribe for more stories that understand. Ikabo tenon, ano in.